Many Christians see Adam and Eve eating the fruit as the very first sin, the moment when sin cosmically affected the entire world, the beginning of all decay, death, and pain of humans and animals. Said people are often shocked to find nothing close to this in Genesis. Rather, Paul in Romans 8 is the main reason people take such a view. Ironically, it's not even clear if Paul was thinking about Adam at all when he mentioned the creation being subjected to futility. Today, we will show why people take such views, as well as a more biblical way of looking at the topic. By the way, I want to remind you that there are a lot of reasons why people think Adam eating the fruit was the origination of all decay and everything that's bad in the world. But that is not based on Romans 8. You can come away from this video realizing that all of your main views are the same, but simply have a different interpretation of Romans 8. But anyways, we will first quickly go through the text of Genesis, highlighting the key points of what exactly Adam and Eve's choice did to the world. The first thing worthy of mention is how God cursed the serpent. He explicitly says, "Cursed are you above all livestock and wild animals," to which some argue God is cursing all animals, but that is vague at best. In reality, it doesn't even say God was the one who cursed the serpent. It is a claim about how the world is, rather than God commanding or causing something to happen. Next, God pronounces consequences for the serpent to crawl on its belly, eat dust, and have enmity between the serpent and the woman's offspring. Next, God speaks to the woman in regards to something child pregnancy related, as well as social relations between husband and wife. Finally, God gets to Adam, pointing out how the ground is cursed because of Adam. Dr. William Horst says, in the most straightforward reading of Genesis, the curse on the ground relates to its agricultural yield, since the explicit result is that Adam will work the fields in order to cultivate wheat, with which to make bread, instead of enjoying the free fruit that is so abundantly present in the Garden of Eden. Nothing in the early chapters of Genesis suggests that this agrarian curse has anything to do with the introduction of processes of decay to a creation that previously lacked such a phenomena. Adam and Eve are warned that they will surely die if they eat the forbidden fruit, but this appears to result from their being denied access to the tree of life when they are expelled from the garden. The curse on the ground is associated with a change in the amount of toiling Adam will need to do to provide for his family, not with human mortality or any other change to the created order. It is certainly conceivable that Paul does imagine that the Edenic lapse introduced mortality and other aspects of decay to God's creation, but the evidence in favor of finding an allusion to the curse of Eden behind the subjection of creation to corruption in Romans is flimsy at best, and scholars do not normally offer compelling argumentation in favor of it. See, we don't see anything close to the very beginning of animal death, decay, or everything that's bad in the world. Even God telling Adam and Eve that they will die has multiple different possible interpretations, as discussed previously on the channel. So the obvious question becomes, what did Paul say that makes so many people certain that Adam's sin caused the beginning of all things terrible? Not only on earth, but even in space. What does Paul say that makes people postulate all kinds of radical changes to the most fundamental laws of how the world works? After mentioning the corruption and sin in the world, and then the one man, Adam, being what appears by many to be the origin of sin, Paul in Romans 8 says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. While these references might seem like they definitely refer to Genesis, it may even refer to an explanation of where everything bad in the world came from. We will soon see how not only is this probably not the origin of all this stuff, but there's a good chance it's not even a reference to Adam at all. Before we think about what Paul was referring to, let's talk about how we would figure out what resource or narrative a writer like Paul was referring to. When biblical experts try to figure out what other situations or writings someone like Paul could have been thinking about when writing, they look to a number of different things, like if similar words, ideas, or concepts are used. For example, if Paul uses the word Adam. Well, there's only one popular Adam in Jewish thought, so that's most likely referring to the Adam of Genesis. But it's still technically possible he could be referring to an Adam that lived in the first century with Paul. If Paul mentions Adam and a serpent, that's going to be very likely that he's referring to Genesis. But it's still technically possible he's referring to a person named Adam and his pet serpent from the first century. Paul could mention someone named Adam, Eve, and a serpent, and it is still theoretically possible, unlikely, but possible, that Paul is referring to something different than the Garden of Eden of Genesis. Similarly, if Paul mentions a man in a garden, that probably still refers to Adam, but can possibly simply refer to a very different man in a different garden. So what that means is that we can't simply assume that if someone like Paul mentions something like we see in Genesis, that it necessarily means he's referring to that. To help us find out what Paul is referring to, it'll be helpful to look at if Paul is using similar words as what we see in Genesis. The same words will be much more useful than vague words that can apply to other stories. Like if Paul says, "Remember the trees from the Old Testament," you might think, oh, that has to be the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Could also refer to the trees in Ezekiel, trees mentioned in the Psalms, the many other trees in other texts. For that reason, scholars look for phrases or themes that only are used one or two places to help narrow things down what writers are referring to. If Paul uses a word or phrase only used in Genesis, that would certainly raise the probability he's referring to Genesis. On the topic of Romans 8, there are a number of different things in this passage which make a long list of scholars conclude Paul is referring to Adam as the cause of this creation groaning. First, the obvious one is that Paul says the creation was subjected to futility, while Genesis 3:17 says the ground was cursed. The question, of course, is who subjected the creation to futility according to Paul? The Greek word for was subjected is in what Greek translators call the aorist tense, which often, but not always, means the thing being referred to only happens once. In other words, the use of the aorist tense makes scholars think that whatever creation that was subjected, it must have been a creation that was only subjected once. The thought process goes that in Paul's letter, Adam had just been mentioned a few chapters ago as the way sin came into the world in one instance, so that seems like a match. One of the best ways to know if an ancient writer was referencing a work is if they would use the same language as the other text. While Paul doesn't use the same language in reference to the subjection of the earth, scholars note how the word for groaning that the earth does in Romans 8 is the same word mentioned in the Greek version of Genesis 3:16 when God said the woman would have some type of pain and trembling when bearing children. On a bit of a side note, some also argue Paul is combining verse 16 where it says the woman will tremble when bearing children with the earth being cursed, and they say that's why Paul is mentioning the earth having birth pangs. Finally, some will cite Genesis 3:15, what many call the Evangelion, the supposed prophecy where the serpent will strike the heel of the woman's offspring while the offspring will crush the serpent's head. They cite this because the entire point of the groaning of the creation is to point out the anticipation of Jesus redeeming the world. The idea behind the crushing of the serpent, according to said people, is that Jesus will defeat the devil. So it seems on face value that both texts have similar themes of the conquering of bad things. The logic goes that because Paul must be referencing Adam's sin and therefore the cursing of the ground, that instance must have caused the death, decay, and disorder of the natural world we see today. For more on that, you can check out the below resources. The problem with these proposed evidences is that each mention of the earth being subjected or groaning being mentioned is that there are multiple places where each one occurs. For example, if Paul said, "Remember that time where Adam ate from the fruit and then God cursed the ground. Well, now the creation groans." Well, then it would be obvious because there's only one place where that happens. At the same time, the language that Paul actually uses in Romans 8 is similar to other places. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in reference to Adam. Let's look at these other evidences with other explanations in order to help conclude what Paul was referring to. First, the most common reason people cite is that Paul mentions a creation that was subjected to futility. While most people are familiar with God cursing the ground in Genesis, many will be surprised to know that there are 9 passages in the Old Testament where the earth mourns in response to human sin or divine judgment on sin. It is not as if Genesis is the only time where this happens. We will talk more about that later. The key thing to note is that simply a reference to God subjecting creation doesn't give us much indication on what Paul was referring to. The strongest linguistic link we have of referencing Genesis is the use of the Greek word for groaning, which isn't the exact same word, but rather has the same root word as used in Genesis 3:16. The first problem is that this word for groaning is used in many different places in the Septuagint. So it is possible that Paul is referring to Genesis. It's also possible Paul is referring to many of the other ways that he's used. Just to be clear, the Septuagint is roughly the Greek version of the Old Testament that the New Testament writers had at the time. They did have access to Hebrew, but most often they quoted in Greek. Even in English, groaning can refer to someone in reference to birth, or little Timmy groaning because he has a tummy ache. You might think, well, in Romans 8 it says the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains. So maybe the word for labor pains isn't specifically used for Genesis, but the idea of it is mentioned, so that's what Paul is referencing. While this is certainly possible, this interpretation only works on very specific translations. While many translations say something like, the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, which might make you think of Genesis, the Greek text of Paul's letter isn't incredibly clear on what type of groaning Paul had in mind, which explains why many translations like the NET translation say something like, "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers together until now." There's no mention of a birth pangs, without any reference to a woman in pain. We won't get into the complexities of translations here, but you can check out the below articles for information on that discussion. If we assume the labor pain idea is correct, it's still not a direct link, as the idea in Romans 8 would be metaphorical, as the earth doesn't literally groan, while in Genesis 3 of the Septuagint, the book Paul is reading from, in Genesis of the Septuagint, it is referring to literal birth groanings of a woman. The possible reference is even weaker when we realize Genesis 3 never says the creation or earth was having labor pains. Genesis 3 mentions some type of groaning regarding the women and children, while Paul is using the word to describe the metaphorical groaning of creation. If Paul is referring to the groaning of Genesis 3, it would make little sense for Paul to assign such groaning to the earth. There are 2 other instances in Romans 8 where the word for groaning is mentioned, one in regard to the Holy Spirit groaning, and another in regard to the groaning that believers experience as they are waiting for the earth to be renewed. Neither have to do with birth groanings. In other words, if Paul is referencing the groanings of birth, like mentioned in Genesis 3, the only time he is doing it is in possibly reference to the earth having birth groanings. If there's no reference to birth groanings by Paul, it's an even weaker connection. As we said before, there is a linguistic connection that the same root word is used, but it's not a strong connection, and it has many different meanings. While that is the only word possibly cited from Genesis 3, proponents of the view that Paul is referencing Genesis correctly mention that words don't have to be explicitly used for someone to reference something. While a lack of linguistic correspondence drastically lowers the probability that something is being referenced, themes or ideas can be referenced without a direct linguistic connection. As mentioned before, many conclude the subjugation of creation must have been regarding Adam because he was mentioned previously in Romans. In support, many mention the aorist sense of the Greek word might be often used to refer to one instance of something happening, but is also used collectively, like in Romans 3:23, which says that all humans have sinned. Surely, nobody would say that humans only sinned once. So while this aorist Greek tense is most often used of one specific event, it doesn't rule out other options for continuing events of subjugation. The third major reason mentioned previously is that some think Paul has the evangelion of Genesis 3:15 in view. The verse says, "And I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." There's no mention of a serpent, heel, a woman, crushing, or any of the common ideas people reference when they mention Genesis 3:15. None of that's in Paul. If Paul is referencing Genesis 3:15, it is weak at best, as the only even remotely similar concept is the idea of redemption and victory of believers. The most we can say that this is a vague reference to the Evangelion, but that's, as I said, vague at best, and therefore isn't a strong reason to conclude that Paul is referencing it just based off this. For example, maybe Paul is referencing Isaiah 65 with the new heavens and new earth, or messianic promises of other passages. See, we can't simply assume that Paul is referencing the Evangelion when there's a lot of other different options. So we've talked about the possible references that Paul is making to Genesis 3. They're possible, but are quite vague. As we will see, there are much stronger options we can take that include all together. When we dig through the Hebrew Bible looking for an odd phrase like the earth mourning, similar to what we see in Romans 8, we find a long list of texts which share a ton of similarities. In each of these passages, we see human sinning, not one man, but many humans sinning, which caused the earth to mourn. Repeat, in each of these passages, we see human sinning, not one man, but many humans sinning, which causes the earth to mourn. We have 9 separate passages where this happens. 9. Let's take a look at a few to get what I mean. In Hosea, we see all the bad sins that are happening by people. Therefore, the earth mourns. It even says all who live in it languish. The animals, birds, and fish are all suffering the negative effects. It should be noted that this is very hyperbolic, as often is in these texts. The obvious example is how it says there is no knowledge of God, even though the writer of Hosea, who was in Israel, clearly had a knowledge of God. When we look at Jeremiah 4, we see all kinds of references to Genesis 1, except that it's a reverse. Instead of God creating the world, the land is so ruined that it is going back into the chaotic, non-existent state that it was before it was created. Of course, the land is said to be mourning, and of course, this is hyperbolic. There was obviously people still in the land at the time. In Joel 1, we see the land mourning because of sin. Amos 1:2, the same thing. We can keep going and going. There's more though. Several of these passages include human beings encouraged to groan, which we also see in Romans 8:23 and 26. While it appears that there is a common idea in the Old Testament of a ruined land being assigned emotional outbursts, there is one which stands out in particular when comparing with Paul's account. In Isaiah 24-27, a number of strong parallels appear with Romans 8. This should not be a surprise because in the undisputed letters of Paul references the Septuagint version of Isaiah 25 times, ranking second only to the Pentateuch, which is cited 33 times. The book of Isaiah was clearly on Paul's mind. Just in the first 7 verses, we see a lot of common threads between Paul and Isaiah. Let's read the passage and then note the parallels. We will read from the Greek Septuagint because that is the book Paul probably would have been reading from or had on his mind. Behold, the Lord is about to lay waste the world, and will make it desolate, and will lay bare the surface of it, and scatter them that dwell therein. And the people shall be as the priest, and the servant as the Lord, and the maid as the mistress. The buyer shall be as the seller, the lender as the borrower, and the debtor as his creditor. The earth shall be completely laid waste, and the earth shall be utterly spoiled, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken these things. The earth mourns, and the world is ruined. The lofty ones of the earth are mourning, and she has sinned by reason of her inhabitants, because they have transgressed the law and changed the ordinances, even the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse shall consume the earth, because the inhabitants thereof have sinned. Therefore the dwellers in the earth shall be poor, and few men shall be left. The wine shall mourn, the vine shall mourn, all the merry-hearted shall sigh. The mirth of timbrels have ceased, the sound of the harp has ceased. It goes on, but that's good enough there. The passage begins with a proclamation of devastation brought upon the world by the Lord. The earth will be laid waste, its surface exposed, and its inhabitants scattered. Verse 2 says, people's roles in societal structures will be overturned, with distinctions between different social classes erased. Verse 3 is where it gets spicy. Again, it says the earth will be completely ruined and it will be completely plundered. For the mouth of the Lord spoke these things. In Greek, the phrase completely ruined more literally reads destroyed with decay, or by corruption shall be corrupted. This word for decay is the same term used in Romans 8:21. Richard Bauckham adds how in verse 7, for the mourning of the earth, the Septuagint has penteo, the term commonly used in earth mourning contexts. This same verb occurs in verse 7 to describe the mourning of the wine and the vine. But here the Septuagint also uses the somewhat less common stenazo to describe the groaning of all the merry-hearted. This is the term used by Paul in 3 different forms to describe the groaning of the creation, people, and the spirit in Romans 8:22, 23, and 26. This word in Isaiah has the same Greek root word for the groaning in Genesis, but the Isaiah text has a closer link in meaning to Romans than Genesis 3:16 does when compared with the groaning of people in Romans 8:23. Jonathan Moo adds to these parallels saying Romans 8 and Isaiah 24:27 both include the personification of creation's response to judgment, the promise that God's glory will be revealed, the present waiting of the righteous in expectant hope, the defeat of death, and the possibility of life beyond death. Not to forget the mention of the Greek word for decay in Isaiah 24 and Romans 8, but not in Genesis. The last piece of evidence worth mentioning is that Isaiah 24 mentions the earth mourning, while Romans 8 mentions the earth groaning. You might think one is mourning, while the other is groaning. Dr. L.J. Braaten notes how the Greek cognates mentioned by Paul, represented by stenazine and stenagmon, primarily connote groaning or sighing, especially the groaning connected with mourning and laments. This is the normal usage in the Septuagint. It will be argued that Paul chose this root for 2 reasons. First, it appears often in lament or intercessory context. Second, and more importantly, the term is associated with the mourning of the natural world or creation. Both these ideas are present in the Romans passage. With this in mind, while the words for mourning and groaning are not the exact same, they are heavily conceptually linked and therefore add another parallel, which is a main focus of Paul, while Genesis 3 doesn't mention anything about the earth groaning or moaning at all. Laurie Braaten notes in both passages the created order is suffering under the judgment of God. Isaiah 24 makes it clear that this judgment is due to human sin, something that seems to be implied in Romans 8. As mentioned above, the term used in Isaiah 24 to connote the decay or corruption of the land is the same term Paul uses in Romans 8 to describe the subjection of creation to decay. Furthermore, in both passages, the judgment is not the end. Paul states that the creation was subjected to decay for hope. Likewise, in the larger context of Isaiah 24, God will act to save his people, but until God acts, there will be mourning and groaning. Again, as in Romans 8. The redemption of the children of God in Romans signals creation's redemption. The same seems to be the case in Isaiah 24 to 27. Although Isaiah 24 does not state it explicitly, the deliverance of God's people probably includes the transformation of the created order, since creation's demise has served to punish God's people. Unless God acts to transform the languishing creation, Earth's inhabitants will continue to suffer under divine judgment. As we already know, Paul speaks of the earth groaning. One important question is, why is the earth groaning? Is it because of God cursing the ground due to Adam's sin? Possibly, but that would be groaning that isn't mentioned in Genesis 3. Or is it possible that Paul thinks the earth is groaning because all humans sin? Paul has spent a lot of time previously speaking of how all humans sin. In Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. Paul specifically says the whole creation is groaning. This makes perfect sense considering the whole creation is filled with a bunch of people who won't stop sinning. Interestingly, unlike Genesis, Isaiah says that the earth mourns because of human sin in Israel. Even more surprisingly, in all these passages, including Isaiah, whenever we see the idea of the earth mourning, it is never in reference to Adam and Eve. They clearly didn't find Adam very important in this because Adam is never mentioned in this passage or any other reference to the earth mourning in the Old Testament. If a reason is mentioned, it is because of humans, not Adam. Let's compare Isaiah 24 to 27 in Romans with Genesis 3 in Romans and see which has stronger links. To review, there are four main reasons why people think Paul is citing Genesis. 1. Paul says the creation was subjected to fertility, while Genesis 3:17 says the ground was cursed. We noted how God cursed the ground in Isaiah 24:7, so they are both equally possible just based on this alone. The second reason Paul might be citing Genesis 3 is the Greek word for was subjected is in the aorist tense, which often, but not always, means the thing being referenced is only happening once. We noted how often is not the same as always, and therefore the aorist tense is not much to go off of. Third, scholars note how the word for groaning that the earth does in Romans 8:23, which possibly is a reference to birth pangs, is the same root word mentioned in the Greek version of Genesis 3:16, when God said the woman would have some type of pain and trembling when bearing children. We also noted how Isaiah 24 uses the same root word for groaning, but unlike Genesis, specifically says the earth is mourning, which makes Isaiah 24 a closer link for Paul. Finally, some will cite Genesis 3:15, where Jesus supposedly crushes the serpent, to say that both texts have similar themes of conquering bad things. Of course, we mentioned how Isaiah also has this idea of beating the bad things. If we take the best arguments for those who think Paul is referencing Genesis, to say the groaning and the pain of the earth is caused by Adam and Eve, the best references are all weaker than Isaiah 24 to 27. All of the evidence for Genesis 3 equally applies for Isaiah 24 to 27, but the Isaiah passage has more parallels, or similar but more explicit parallels, with Romans 8 that Genesis 3 does not have. Genesis 3 doesn't have the parallels of the Greek word for decay. There is no personification of the earth in Genesis 3. There's no clear promise that God's glory will be revealed. The present waiting of the righteous and expectant hope is not mentioned. There is no clear reference to a defeat of death or the possibility of life beyond death, all of which Romans and Isaiah have, but not Genesis. As can be seen, there's many strong, directly parallel possible references to Isaiah 24:7 compared to the vague references of Genesis 3. What does this mean for what Paul is thinking? That's the big question, right? If he has Isaiah 24:27 in mind, rather than Genesis 3, he's not making a claim about everything bad in the world coming from the fall. No, just like in Isaiah, the things that are bad are due to the sin of the people in Paul's world. It's not like all death and decay started in Isaiah 24 to 27. Rather, remember that the word for decay that appears in both Romans and Isaiah, but not in Genesis, Bethany Sollereder comments on that, says, note that flora in this context does not mean the instantiation of all decay that has ever happened, as might be imagined in a cosmic fall scenario. It means undue decay or lack of fruitfulness from expected sources, such as the languishing vine causing a lack of wine, or the earth ending up polluted under its inhabitants. So, naturally, if Paul is reading passages like Isaiah 24 and noticing how these aren't the origin of decay, it seems reasonable that the groaning and decay referenced in Romans 8 is the same type of decay of Isaiah 24. In fact, we should look at Romans 8 and see what it actually says. Notice how the verse doesn't say anything about animal death. If we didn't have Isaiah 24 or any of the other verses mentioned decay in the Old Testament, it would still be completely ambiguous what kind of decay this is. Genesis gives us next to no info on a worldwide decay, and likewise Romans 8 on the origin of the laws of thermodynamics. If we take a step back, when we look at Isaiah 24-27 and these other earth moaning passages, the mention of the earth groaning is clearly hyperbole. The mention of the earth moaning is clearly hyperbole. Think of Hosea 4:1-3, where it says, the state of the earth is so bad that there is no knowledge of God in Israel, even though the writer clearly knows about God. It's meant to describe the world as so terrible that the earth groans. Everybody knows the earth doesn't literally groan, and Isaiah 24:7 says there was no fruit on the vines. Jeremiah 4:25 says the birds departed. Are we really going to say the writers thought that there was no fruit on any vine at all in the area, or no birds at all? In this way, is it not possible that this decay that the earth is subject to is not our 21st century view of decay, but rather a figurative way of saying how Paul sees how there is a lot of immorality in the world? Maybe he does see the plants and animals on the earth going into a lesser state, but how do we get from there all the way to every bad thing that has ever happened is due to the subjection of the earth? So we certainly don't get that from Genesis. We certainly don't get that from Romans 8 alone. See, the way people get from Romans 8 vaguely mentioning the world being subjected to decay all the way to Adam causing all the origin of pain and suffering is based on the assumption that there was no decay or pain or suffering before God cursed the ground in the Garden of Eden. And since there seems to be bad things that happened right after Adam's sin, well, this must be the origin of all decay, pain, and suffering. What people don't realize is that if you look at all of the other arguments, except for Romans 8, for the world being perfect before Adam sinned, which I have done on the channel, and you show that there are many reasons, and if you look at the many reasons to think that there actually was sin and death before Adam, well, then there's no reason to look at Romans 8 as the origin of this because it's vague in itself. Something I've noticed in my videos is that I will put a critique saying, God saying the creation was very good doesn't mean perfect and no death. And then people quote Romans 5 to debunk my claim. I then make a video on Romans 5 which doesn't say it was perfect and there was no death before the... And then people will quote their view of Genesis 1 like it debunks Romans 5. Then on both videos they quote Romans 8. Can you guess what will happen in the comments of this video? In other words, it is circular reasoning to use one passage to support a vague passage and then use that same vague passage to support this previous vague passage. But hey, forget all that, okay? Forget all that. Say you watch my videos on those topics and you aren't convinced of that. That's okay. Say for some reason you don't think Paul is thinking of Isaiah 24-27. I still don't think that's a good justification to think Paul is thinking of the origin of all decay in the world. There is other possibilities, like where Paul is thinking of the many other instances that don't include Genesis 3 in the Old Testament, where the earth mourns in response to human sin or divine judgment on sin. In this case, we would still not be able to reasonably conclude that Adam's sin gave us all of the death and decay of the world based off of Romans 8. Now, even though the parallels for Genesis and Romans are quite weak, many scholars have still argued that Paul is including Genesis 3 in with the rest of these mourning of the earth passages. They might argue that he has the general theme in mind of the earth groaning because of sin, even if the earth groaning isn't explicitly stated in Genesis 3. this is certainly possible. I think it'd be helpful here to really simplify what Paul is saying here. So in Paul's passage of Romans 8, he's basically saying creation was subjected and that it's in bondage to decay. And of course, he's saying that that bondage, that decay, it's going to be gone. With that being said, if Paul is referring to all times where creation has been subjected, then that doesn't make any claim at all about when it was first subjected. For example, if I said, when I exercised, I have had lasting effects on my health. In this scenario, by saying when I exercised, I'm referring to the many times where I'm exercising. And each time it has had lasting effects. But there's no way to know by this phrase alone what was the first time that I ever exercised. Likewise, when Paul says that creation was subjected and therefore is in bondage to decay, that if Paul is referring to the general idea of creation being subjected, or if he's referring to the collective amount of times where creation is subjected, then there is no way to know from this passage of Romans 8 alone when Paul would have thought it was first subjected. Now, you might, of course, point to Romans 5, where it says that sin entered the world through one man and death through sin. And even though it seems to only be mentioning human death, and it never says specifically that Paul thought that the same type of subjugation of the earth of Isaiah 24 or Romans 8 is the same one from Genesis 3, at the same time, if you took an Augustinian view like a Romans 5, the classic view most Christians take today, where Adam is the origin of sin and physical death, then it would make sense that Paul would be thinking that sin entered through Adam, and since sin is what causes God to make the ground moan, and these other passages, well, if Paul thinks that sin is required for the bondage to decay, and you think the world didn't have decay and death before Adam, and you think Paul has Genesis 3 at least partially in mind in Romans 8. In other words, if you're able to come to the conclusion that all of those are true, though each one has questionable problems, then yes, it can make sense to think that Paul thought Adam started all the pain and death, and that's what's being said in Romans 8. With that being said, even if you assume all of that, I still don't think you get to the conclusion of the origin of all decay and death. See, at this point, there is still the question of inspiration, and that scripture is inspired in what it teaches. Not every little thing the writer was thinking when writing. Just like we don't think that the emotions come from the heart, or that we live in a solid sky dome, or that there is an underworld under our feet, all things mentioned in the Old Testament, we also don't necessarily have to conclude that Paul was teaching that all death and decay came from Adam in Romans 8. Back to my exercise example. Say hypothetically, if I say that every time I exercise, I get long-lasting health benefits, and therefore you should exercise as well. I might have in mind the first time I exercised, but the point of the lesson was not to make a claim on the first time I exercised. Paul might have thought that Adam was the first person to cause death and decay. I think there's huge reasons to doubt that, but say he did, so what? He also probably had all kinds of weird views on ancient science and the origins of the universe, just like his Jewish companions. The question is, what is he teaching in Romans 8? In Romans 8, Paul is saying that the world is not a good place, and it's not explicitly said, but probably due to sin. The world is not a good place because of sin, but there is hope for the future when all things will be made new. The point of the passage is not to make a historical claim about when sin and death came into the world. It's not, just not there. Finally, there's one other thing worth mentioning, is that if Paul has divine revelation from God, he might have been told by God that the origin of sin and death and decay was not caused by Adam, but he hypothetically knew the audience in Rome he was writing to thought that Adam was the cause of those things, so he mentioned it as a teaching tool for a larger point. In other words, if we assume the 21st century young earth understanding of Romans 8, it is still possible that Paul was simply using as a teaching point, not to distract from what his main argument was, which was that the world is rough and Jesus is going to fix it. If he would have mentioned these other views that conflicted with his audience's view of things, that could have distracted from his main point. Therefore, he kind of does like a devil's advocate and assumes the position even though he doesn't necessarily believe it. To summarize, I've argued that Isaiah 24 is a much stronger reference than Genesis 3, that Paul might be referencing all the other passages of mourning and groaning caused by sin apart from Genesis 3. I've talked about how both of these instances don't get you to Paul thinking Adam was the origin of all death and sin in the world. I've talked about how both Genesis 3 and Romans 8 don't really say anything at all about the origin of death and decay, that they are at best ambiguous on that topic. And also, even if Genesis 3 is in mind, it doesn't mean that was what Paul believed. If it was what Paul believed, it doesn't mean it is what he was teaching. But if you got through all of that and you still aren't convinced, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong after all of that. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. Anyways, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe so you don't miss out on other Genesis topic videos. Maybe even support the channel through Patreon if you can. Let me know how I'm wrong as well. Until next time.